if you look at the economic system and the way that has been run, it has not been run in the interests of people who live in the north of England, of people who live in small towns and villages. It has not been run in their interests. And I spent 2 years as Chief Secretary to the Treasury looking at how they do their economic models. And it is very centric to London, is very centric to the way that the liberal elite look at the world, because those are the people in the Treasury system. And those are the people working at the Bank of England. So there's no doubt in my mind that people are absolutely right to be angry about where we've ended up. I would like to see more of an organised movement like the MAGA movement in the US. That where people aren't just talking about the personalities, they're also talking about what needs to change about our country. And we're starting to talk about that now. Because it's easy to, I can point lots of fingers at lots of people, but, the last time Keir Starmer can go for an election is 2029. By 2029, what would the British public demand that changes about our country to actually start fixing it? That's what is the what that's really important.
Well, it goes back to my point. Sometimes I think it has to get really bad for you to realise. But
people need to be thinking about the what. They need to be thinking about what needs to change. It can't just be we need X person rather than Y person. It's going to be what needs to change.
But sometimes it has to come from real pain. So I've been traveling and making documentaries for the last few years as well. I went out to El Salvador post Bukele, and I've been 4 times, and I've witnessed the change in that country from when just after he got elected to where he is now. This country has gone from having I think it was the highest or the second highest murder rate in the world, to having now the lowest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere. He's completely changed the economy there. He's taken on the IMF. I've been out to Argentina. I've seen what's happened with Malay. I'm aware of what's happening in America. These are hard shifts that people have demanded. Yeah. But from those 2 countries, they had to go through a lot of pain to get there. Yeah. And it's just...
I only wish we hadn't in Britain. This is my... you asked me, did I think it was unfair or did I have regrets? I mean, what really frustrates me is it was obvious the way things were heading in 2022, but there was a massive reluctance to change anything on the part of partly Conservative MPs, but also on the part of the system overall. And it's just incredibly sad that it has to get so much worse for things to change.
I've got a few things here. So a national debt depends where you go, ranging from 2.8 trillion to over 3 trillion, about 110% of GDP. Tax as a percentage of GDP is, I think you said in your book 46%?
That's spending.
Spending,
tax
okay.
Tax is lower than that, but tax will eventually have to catch up with that.
Well, 37.7%, and it's been trending upwards, whilst the value of our pound has been decreasing. UK government debt to reach 310% of GDP by the 2070s. I mean, I think that's, here's the national debt. Yeah. This is the one that always gets me. The interest on our debt alone, 110 billion a year, is nearly 30 billion more than we spend on education. GDP growth estimates vary from 1.2 to 1.7%. Like every single measure is going in the wrong direction. Yeah. Every single measure. The reason I've gone down this rabbit hole, it might not be anything you know anything about, but previous to this, I don't know if you know, this show for 7 years was a show about Bitcoin. It was the biggest show about Bitcoin. That's what we covered, and we decided to move back to the UK and cover politics. But I've been down all these different rabbit holes trying to understand the history of sound money being on the gold standard, why people care about Bitcoin, why things go up in value, down in value. And I've come to the conclusion that a sound economic basis is what any government needs.
Yeah. And sound money.
Sound money, yeah. I mean, I don't know if we could or would return to a sound money standard.
I think we definitely need to return to an accountable Bank of England. So...
Do we need a central bank?
That's an interesting question. Well, if we do have one, it ought to be accountable. So at the moment, we've got the worst of all worlds. We've got an unaccountable central bank. So what Gordon Brown did in making it independent, and you can see the results. We've had huge levels of inflation. We had QE that went on for far too long. Asset price spikes, essentially supporting very, very lax government spending policies with printing money.
Yeah.
That's what's going on. And the result was inflation. And we were told beforehand that it was going to be transitory. And it wasn't transitory, even though the lessons had all been learnt before. And nobody has been held accountable for that, even though it's created massive pain for British people. So, I mean, I am a supporter of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. I think they're a good thing. I think they help take power away from central banks. So in that respect, they're a good thing. I'm very, very worried about anything like a central bank digital currency.
I completely
agree.
agree.
I think give the state huge amounts of power. And what we know is overweening state power is not a good thing. Could we move to a world free of central banks? It's a beautiful idea.
The free market for money.
A beautiful idea. You've obviously had Steve Baker on your show.
Well, I've covered this prior to Steve. So my friend Nick wrote an article called. He wrote two. Can you look up?
Nick Carter.
Nick Carter's article. He wrote an article called "Bitcoin: A Peaceful Revolution," which was brilliant. But he wrote an article about the history of the free market for money, and he kind of spiked my interest in an idea that we would be better accepting volatility, accepting bank failures, and having a free market for money. And then I realized, actually, I'm already operating a free market for money because I keep 99% of my money in Bitcoin anyway. And that is a free market for money. A
most peaceful revolution.
A most peaceful revolution. Yeah, very interesting
I
argument.
certainly think that the monetary policy and the whole monetary system needs to be re-examined and thought about. And the problem in Britain is it became a taboo subject. When I was at the Treasury and tried to ask about monetary policy, I was told it wasn't our responsibility. It was the responsibility of the Bank of England. And I said, well, the Chancellor's there to set the terms the Bank of England operates on. The Chancellor's the politician, not the Governor of the Bank of England. The Chancellor should have a view on monetary policy. And during the leadership campaign in 2022, where I flagged up all the policies I was going to pursue, I said that we should look again at the Bank of England's mandate. And again, I was accused of attacking the Bank of England's independence. So they weren't interested in what the actual monetary policy was. They were interested in my attack on the Bank of England's independence. And whenever an organisation justifies itself by saying it's independent, that, in my view, is a red flag that there is a problem. So all of this should be talked about. The international monetary system, the independence of central banks, the role of cryptocurrencies. I think all of those things, under the surface of what's gone wrong over the past 30 years, monetary policy is very important, but we haven't talked about it.
Can I tell you about a couple of things that I've experienced that I've gone through, which seem ludicrous? I'd love your perspective on. I was a Lloyds Bank customer for 25 years, and I got a phone call one day from a call centre. Somebody worked in there, I had no idea, sounded about 25 years old, asking me about a couple of my transactions. I said, which ones? And they brought up two where I transferred money to a Bitcoin exchange. And I said, am I under investigation? They said, no, we just want to know why you're transferring this money. I said, well, I'm a grown adult. I've got two kids and run 4 businesses. It's none of your business. 3 days later, they closed down my bank account. I got a letter. Sorry, 2 weeks later, 3 days later, I got a letter, closed down my bank account. I then moved to another bank, a neobank. They closed down my bank account because my podcast was about Bitcoin. And I got a payment from a company, a sponsor, which is a Bitcoin company. They closed down my bank account. So I'm now with Revolut, and Revolut works very well for me. But so many people I know have either had bank accounts closed or they've had restrictions put on them to even purchase Bitcoin, which they see as an escape. And now we're in this ludicrous place where you have to be a high net worth investor now to buy Bitcoin. Yet I can download infinite gambling apps on my phone and bet on the price of ping pong or the next point in tennis. And it feels like the banking system has become part of the surveillance
They
state.
don't want to lose control. They don't want to lose control.
But it also feels like part of the surveillance state as well.
Well, yes, and as the politically exposed person rule, you remember the whole Nigel Farage bank account incident. I've struggled to get bank accounts and things like that for that reason.
You have as well.
Yeah. It's very, very difficult for politicians to operate. But for that reason.
But you're the guy you're the guys in. Sorry, I say guys.
But you're still subject. You're still subject to all these rules, and I mean, I think all of this in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, there was a lot of extra bureaucracy created. It hasn't actually helped customers. It's just made the whole system bureaucratic, and as you say, increased levels of interference.
Well, even if you're taking money out as cash these days, if you want to take out a couple of £1,000 at a branch, you get interrogated on your own money, Liz. And I don't understand how the banking system now has been weaponized against the productive parts of society. Surely we should be helping and supporting the productive parts of society.
But this comes from, it always starts with, we want to protect people from, making bad investment decisions, or we want to give them a chance to think about what they've done, or, we want to make sure that, a lot of the politically exposed person came in through anti-money laundering legislation. And then there is a mission creep. And essentially, when I was saying about unelected state bureaucrats having unaccountable power, well, when the state regulates industries, it also means those people have unaccountable power, because you're giving them unaccountable power by proxy. And this is exactly what happened with the post office scandal.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the post office were given the power to prosecute people? And the minute you give people unaccountable power, it always gets misused by bad people who want to cover things up, or people with ideological motives. It always gets misused. So we have to be very careful about where state power gets used.
So how should we change the economic foundation or the economic policies of our country? What is required to make us a more prosperous country, to drive growth? Because I'm pretty sure there's nothing Labour's going to do over the next 5 years that will drive meaningful growth.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, all they're going to do is make everything worse.
Yes.
From a bad position.
Well, I can say that as a business owner.
So what do we need to do? We need to abandon net zero and repeal the Climate Change Act. We need to get fracking. That was one of the things that drove the American energy revolution, was fracking. Cheap energy made it much easier to manufacture, much easier to run a business. We know there's going to be lots of businesses like AI that require high levels of energy. We need to get fracking, abandon net zero. We need to abolish...
Stops that? Let's just deal with each one at a time then.
Oh my God, there's a very long list.
Yeah, I know, but okay, cool. So what stops us abandoning net zero?
Well, you've got a government that are ideologically committed, and Ed Miliband put in this piece of legislation in 2008, the Climate Change Act. They're ideologically committed. They are believers in Greta Thunberg. They're friends with the people that stick themselves to the road. They say we've got a government that's ideologically opposed, but I think ideologically opposed to what I'm saying. But I also think we need the public to speak up more. I mean, we have the highest energy bills in the developed world. Maybe if there were more protests, or the farmers came out and protested about inheritance tax, but where are the householders saying, we're not putting up with this anymore? We've got the highest energy bills in the world. We don't actually want to pursue a suicidal net zero policy when nobody else is doing it, which they're not. This is all about political will, but in Westminster, there's a panoply of vested interests constantly lobbying. The green energy companies are there lobbying for more subsidies. Dale
Vince.
You've got Dale Vince, you've got the
Big
sort of
Labour
swampy types, the Just Stop Oil blocking the roads, etc. And there needs to be a countervailing force, which is what I'm talking about, political movements. There needs to be a countervailing force saying, we're not going to put up with these high energy prices anymore. Businesses need to talk about this. I mean, businesses have only started, or big business in particular, complaining after the budget. Even though the Labour Party spent the entire election campaign saying we're going to put in all these nutty net zero policies, they pretty much admitted they were going to raise tax. But there were a lot of businesses that were quite quiet and have only started complaining now.
Check Sky News. I think some retailer just came out today, said they're closing more stores because of the budget.
Why weren't they? Where were they 3, 4, 5 years ago? Anyway, the other things we need to do, Town and Country Planning Act 1947, probably the most damaging piece of legislation in British history, needs to be repealed.
Don't know anything about it.
So this was under the Clement Attlee government, and essentially it nationalised land and made it much harder to build houses. So in the 1930s, and you can see this, all the semis that have been built around cities like Leeds or London or wherever, they were all built in the 1930s before the Town and Country Planning Act. We were building 300,000 homes a year.
Mm-hmm.
Labour can't manage that now. But in 1947, the Attlee government put in the Town and Country Planning Act, put in the huge green belts around cities, some of which aren't green. It's one thing I agree with Keir Starmer on. There is a grey belt. But also just made it incredibly cumbersome to build houses. You have to get permission from the local council to do what you want on your own land. Until we get rid of that, I think it is very difficult for things to get built in this country.
Should government be building houses?
No. These houses in the 30s were being built entirely by the private sector. 300,000 houses a year. And it was all ruined by the Attlee government.
Okay.
So those are two things that I do.
Yeah.
Massively cut the size of government. I'm a Javier Milei fan.
You're a libertarian. You're a libertarian conservative.
I think somebody said that a conservative is a libertarian with daughters, and I have 2 daughters. So
I have one. Yeah, I could agree with that one.
So it ought to. I mean, these words like libertarian or conservative, it all depends how you interpret them.